Well, first off, good morning all. Hope you're having a good conference. My name is Richard Taylor. I'm a sales engineer with InterSystems. And what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about LDAP, and the title you can see Beyond the Simple Schema. Basically, what do you do when the basics are not enough? So what we're going to cover today, and more importantly, what we're not going to cover today, we're not going to cover LDAP setup. We're going to be working with Open LDAP 2.4, which I have set up in a CentOS environment, but we're not going to talk about how to set that up. I'm sure you guys already work with LDAP or at least have some familiarity, and that's way beyond the 45 minutes we have. We're also not going to talk a lot about how you define the basic setup within InterSystems. I'm going to walk through it a little bit, but that is very well documented, and we've got some more interesting things to go into. And that is what happens when that's not enough. What happens when you have to go beyond the simple configuration? We are going to set up a demonstration scenario, and we're going to walk through the tools that you would use and show you some code as to how you would accomplish that. So first off, just to get everybody started off here, what is LDAP? So it stands for Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. It's a way of interacting with a directory structure over a TCP protocol. This is used more primarily where you have situations where you're going to access information a lot, but only update it infrequently. It's not really well suited for environments where you're transactional. It is a database type structure. But when you're talking about user authentication, it's perfect, because you're going to access that a lot, and you're not going to update it often. And that's about the only thing I will say about defining LDAP. So how does InterSystems work out of the box with LDAP? First thing you have to know is we have many different protocols for authentication. You have to turn it on. It's not available by default. You're going to go to a place in the System Manager portal. You see the links there. And you're going to turn this thing on. Once it's turned on, you then have to go to each binary, each process or service that you want to use that protocol in, and tell that service, use LDAP. So if you want to use Telnet, which is what we're going to do, you have to go to the Telnet service and say, I want you to use LDAP. If you have a CSP application that you want to use LDAP, you have to go to that CSP application and say, use LDAP. When you go to set this up within InterSystems, there are some basic things, basic information that we need to have to satisfy the security protocols of the InterSystems platform. We need to know the namespace. We need to know a routine. Those are optional. We need to know the roles, and this is the important one. We have to know what you're allowed to do. So in LDAP, there's a couple of ways that you can indicate that for InterSystems in a basic setup. The first is you set up registered properties, and we provide you with a definition that you would include in your LDAP schema that defines the name. Okay. Sorry about that, folks. I don't know what happened there. Plug came loose. You define the namespace, InterSystems-namespace, InterSystems-routine. These are properties that you would add to your schema within LDAP. And we've actually already registered those OIDs. So an OID is an object ID. It's a big, long, nasty-looking number that you have to register your properties. And we've already done that. We've also registered the class, the object class that you would use to actually define those properties within the schema for a user. Now, you don't have to do that. If you really don't want to modify your schema, you can reuse any existing field, but you got to be real careful about that. Because next month, when you buy that new piece of software and you install it, and it says, I want you to use this property for my things, you're kind of in trouble. So, usually if you're going to do this, you're going to want to use the registered properties or register your own properties. And the way that would look when you actually go into the System Management portal is down here at the bottom. Down here at the bottom, you have those list of properties that okay, I'm not using the little red dot. It seems like every time I use the pointer, it doesn't like it. But down here at the bottom, you'll see where those properties are, and that's where you could go and actually change to any property you want. But there's another way you can do this, and it's actually the default way, and that is to define groups within LDAP that indicate the values that we want. And you turn that on here where it says LDAP Groups for roles, routines, and namespace. And by default, that is checked off. And the way you do this is we tell you to use group names that have a particular structure. So you would set up a group name that starts with InterSystems-namespace and then dash something else. And the something else is the value that you want. So in this case, namespace-user. We also have namespace-routine and namespace-role. Note that's not plural. So if you actually look at a full example of this, if I want to take the user Rich, and I want them to be able to go into start in the namespace My App, I want them to have the roles of developer and app support, and when they start up, they have to start in the routine main menu. So I would have to set up and make Rich a member of these following groups in LDAP. I'd set up a group called InterSystems-name-MyApp, InterSystems-routine-main menu, and then the role for developer and the role for app support. Now, if you end up with a fairly complex structure, you're obviously adding a lot of groups, and that can sometimes be an issue. So, why are those options not enough? Why is it that you wouldn't want to just take advantage of what's already there? Because you can define groups all over the place. Turns out there's a lot of reasons. I'm sure you guys out here can come up with a dozen more reasons than anything I'm going to present. But I like to group them into 3 areas. There's compliance, control, and complexity. So for compliance, there's government regulations that you might be impacting on. Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA, SEC regulations. I know, for example, with Sarbanes-Oxley, you have separation of responsibilities. You can't always have the same person doing 2 distinct roles because that leaves an opening for somebody to cheat the system. You might have company policies. Maybe your company policy is that my LDAP directory structure and groups are going to reflect my organizational structure, not my application structure. There's also control. Usually, the person maintaining LDAP and the person maintaining application security are a different person, or at least often. They may not necessarily want to share well between each other. So one guy wants to, who's going to be responsible for this? One guy wants to control it, one guy doesn't want to do the work. They may be unwilling to modify the LDAP environment. It cannot always be easy to do, especially in Active Directory, to modify this stuff. And there could be departmental segregation. So LDAP, the maintenance, usually falls under network admin, and you've got another group that's maintaining your application. So you've got a reporting structure issue there. And then lastly, there's complexity. And complexity comes in several different levels. It could be as simple as, I just don't have the skill set to modify this schema. Don't know how to do it, can't learn it, just not going there. The application model itself could be too complex to reasonably model within LDAP. You can model a lot of different things. You can create nested objects, you can create a lot of different structures within LDAP, but the more you add, the more complex it becomes, the slower your authentication becomes. So it's not always reasonable to do that. And lastly, your application security model itself may need to do things outside of just a basic authentication. So you have to have a way of injecting some code or some way of working with that. And in our example, we're going to set up a situation where the application requires an in-memory profile that exists. So obviously, our LDAP is not going to do that. And you want to keep your authentication and your authorization in the same atomic process. You don't want to, okay, I'm going to let you all the way in, and then you're in the system, and then add more security. Leaves a hole. So of these, you're going to find usually, I keep trying to use that pointer, you're going to find the issues of control and the complexity of the application security, usually the reasons you end up going down this path. So let's set up our little problem here. So I have a company. They've had an application that's existed for a while. It's an older application. It has its own built-in security model. They've added LDAP for their network security, and users are saying, you know, I don't want to know 2 different passwords and 2 different usernames. Why do I have to do this? You know, just get this out of my way. So how do I deal with that? In our particular model, the application itself is just not feasible. It's all the code everywhere is checking the application security model to find out whether they should be allowed to do something. So if I turn around and interject LDAP and say, well, I'm just going to use LDAP, and I'm just going to use the basic definition, I've got to change all that code. Not really feasible. Within our situation, we have an application that's spread across multiple namespaces by module. The application user ID has existed previously and is different from the structure they set up in LDAP. The rules for LDAP users were different from the application, so we have different user IDs. We have user types that define the cache security role, so they have a little interaction with the cache security model. And finally, we have to tell the security model of the application which modules they're allowed to access and which menus within those modules they're allowed to access. And by module, we also know what namespace we're supposed to start in. So to define this, and by the way, this is not a real application. I'm not actually going to show you a screen or thing, and we're just going to simulate this. But we have some structures that are set up for the user type, so I know what my cache roles are, and my app modules, which tell me which namespace to deal with. So that's the application environment that we're going to try and create a security model for working with LDAP. So, as I said before, you need to have a way of interjecting your code and your logic into that process. It turns out we provide you one. It's called Delegated Authentication. And basically what you're doing when you say, I want to use Delegated Authentication for a process, you're telling Cache is, don't worry about it, I'm going to handle it. You just go away, and I'll tell you everything you need to know. You have to create a routine called Z-Authenticate. And that Z-Authenticate has a particular structure. There is a sample in the namespace that has copious comments in it. So all the options you could possibly think of are documented within the routine. So when you go to create this routine, the very first thing you want to do is either copy that routine verbatim or at least take the signatures of the entry points so that you have exactly what you're supposed to use. So now what we have to do is we have to tell the system, just like with LDAP, I have to tell the system that delegated authentication is going to be allowed and who's going to use it. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm in my management portal here, if I can get this. Okay, this is somewhat embarrassing. You know, I'm going to unplug your mouse because it's apparently interfering with my system. I'll just use this. Let's try this again. Well, this is not fun. Okay, well, there's more than one way to skin a cat here. Let me talk to you about it. So, you're going to go to that screen that I showed you before, and you're going to turn on the LDAP authentication, or sorry, the delegated authentication. I'll tell you what we're going to do here. I'm going to restart this while I talk, and then we'll go in and look at it. So you're going to go to the System Management Portal, you're going to go into Security, you're going to go into System Options, and you're going to go into the Authentication and CSP selection from there. That has a list of checkboxes for which methods of authentication are allowed for the whole system. One thing you're going to note is you do not turn on LDAP, because as far as cache is concerned, as far as InterSystem is concerned, you're not using LDAP, you're using your own code, not our code. So you're going to check off delegated authentication. We're going to set up Telnet as our method of doing authentication. And what you do with that is you go into the services area of the security, so system admin, security, services. You open up the service of Telnet, and you say that I want to use delegated. And in our case, I turned it so that it's only using delegated authentication. Let's see if this is going to let me in now. Okay, we're going to leave the management portal alone for now then. So once you've got that set up, and again, there's the path that you go to, and you've set up your allow delegated authentication on your service, you then want to start coding the interface. And we happen to provide you with a nice library for doing that. It's called sys-LDAP. And that's our API for handling all your integrations with the LDAP server. Again, this is your code path to getting into LDAP. And from there, you can add, modify, and delete LDAP entries. You can fully interact with LDAP. We also provide you with a sample routine called it's called LDAP.mac. That's also in the samples namespace. So you can look at that, and it walks you through several of those things. But what we're going to use is just a simple authentication and searching capability. So we're going to work with init. Init binds you or gives you a handle to your LDAP server. Simple binds allows us to log in or bind to the LDAP server. That's actually how you authenticate the user. You try and log into the LDAP server with that username and password. And finally, we're going to use search, because in order to get the properties of that user, we have to search. And you're going to see in a moment that it actually kind of is backwards from the way you might expect that you would work with this. Now, one thing to note is if you are using Active Directory, some of the individual properties are a little different because the authentication models and the way you talk to Active Directory is slightly different. Well documented, it's not a problem. You just have to pass in different properties. So for that, you use the binds method, not the simple binds method. So our example. We're first going to set up a simple situation where all we're going to do is use LDAP to authenticate, and then we're going to pass off to the application all the other work. We're going to use an application module. Everything else is going to happen through the application. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So this is Atelier, by the way, if you haven't seen the presentations on this. This is our Z-Authenticate routine, and you see it has a particular calling structure. So again, that's why I recommend that you cut and paste this from the example. Just save yourself some heartburn. And again, it's very well documented as to what all those things are. I did include the sys-LDAP include file so I can use certain definitions and certain static definitions within my code. I've also defined some top-level things like our base DN, our base domain name, or distinguished name. LDAP is a directory structure. You need to provide the full path to whatever you're trying to authenticate. So what you're indicating here is, what's the root directory I'm going to start with when I do my searches? What's the root directory I'm going to use when I want to bind this particular user? I also need to know which property within LDAP is the unique identity. So I'm using the UID as the unique identity within LDAP. I created a method here. I'll talk about that later. That's just making things a little bit easier on us when we do some error reporting. So what do you need to start off? I need to know where the server is. So I have these things defined in a global. It can be an IP address or a network name. I need to know who the administration user is. There's a user that you define within LDAP that's allowed to do the searches, not the user you're authenticating. And what's the password for that admin user? Very first thing we're going to do is we're going to bind or get the handle to our server. This turns out to be an integer value. If it returns a 0, that means something's wrong. So we look to find what the error is, and I report that. And again, make sure your code here is robust. If you have failures here, you're going to get access denied, and it's not going to tell you why. You're going to have to go, because it's authentication, they don't want to give you a lot of information back. They just say, you couldn't log in, you need to go and talk to your admin. You can go to logs and you can find out in more detail what happened, but the access denied if you have code problems. So I put a try-catch around the whole thing so these things can be reported very consistently. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to bind here to the administrator. So I'm logging in now to LDAP, I'm binding to LDAP as the administrator so I can do a search. This is kind of a little backwards from what you might think. I'm going to log in as the admin, I'm going to search for the user. That's the first thing I'm going to do. So down here, I'm going to use my search, and I've set up certain parameters here, like I define the filter using the filter property that I created above. I'm telling the system what scope to use. So you can scope things to say only search the base domain, search only the subtrees, or search the entire tree starting from the base domain. The default, as we've set up here, is to search the whole tree. With that information, I can now do a search. And when I get that search back, I'm going to check. I only want to see one return. This user should be unique. So I'm doing some checking here. I'm getting the count entries. I'm going to find out how many entries were returned. I'm going to check to make sure that it's not -1, which means an error, not 0, which means I couldn't find you, and it's not more than 1. Because if you have more than one user being returned from that search, that's a problem. How did I get 2 users with the same unique name? I can't authenticate you, I gotta throw you back out. And the last thing we're gonna do is we're gonna take the information that we just queried, and we're gonna capture that. Now, because I only expect 1 entry back, I'm just going to get the first entry here. And then I'm going to go through that entry to make my life easier. Because I'm lazy, I want to make my life easier. I'm going to roll through that, all the attributes that exist for that entry, and I'm going to capture them to a global. So that's going to include all the parameters that we might define for the user in the LDAP structure. Before I can actually authenticate the user himself, so now I've logged in, I've queried the user, I've gotten all the information about that user, but I still haven't authenticated that user. So what I want to do is I want to get the distinguished name. That's the full path to where this user exists. So if you've worked with LDAP before, it's going to look something like UID equals rich, comma, DC equals intersystems, comma, DC equals com. That's the full directory path to where that user is existing. Because again, I can have multiple tree structures. Just like on your file system, I can have multiple files called log.txt. Just saying log.txt does not give me a unique identity. I have to know where I'm looking. So I need to get that distinguished name. From that, I'm now going to actually authenticate the user. Now I'm going to go in and call simple binds. I'm going to pass that distinguished username, and I'm going to pass in the password, and I'm going to say, hey, did it succeed? Note I'm using my little macro. I wanted to throw exceptions, because I like using try-catch for error trapping. I wanted to throw an exception if the LDAP status is not a success. So I created this little macro. It's not returning a % status value. It's its own thing. So I actually have to query into the LDAP interface to get the error message back. That macro includes and encompasses all of that. So it generates the exception and builds in the error message. If you're curious, we can go back up and look at that later. Now, in this simple case, in my example 1, when you do delegated authentication, you have to tell cache, tell InterSystems, how do I build this user? Because the user is actually going to exist in the cache security model. If you look in the user's area, it will be there. And it will be flagged as delegated. That's how it was created, and you won't be able to edit it. It's just there as a placeholder. Every time you use that user through delegated authentication, whatever properties you pass in either create or update the profile within cache or within your systems. So in this case, I'm going to take and get the attributes of the full name and put it in the property of full name for cache, the namespace, and in this case, I'm doing a simple authentication. I'm not trying to make anything unique to cache. The application down here, the My App Security call, that handles all of my authorization, all of it. I've authenticated the user against LDAP, and as far as authorization is concerned, I'm handing all of that off to the application. But I still need to satisfy cache. Cache still has to have some information about this person, so I defined a hard-coded structure here. I'm going to give them the username, the password, I'm going to give them the one role. A lot of times people who do things with an application security model leave the unknown user turned on, and that's how they take care of this. Real bad idea. Never leave unknown user defined, or if you have to, you definitely don't leave the %all role on that user, which again, I've seen more times than I care to admit. Delegate authentication is a great way of handling this, because it's not limited to LDAP, by the way. We're talking about LDAP today, but I can do any authentication here. I have a user who has a web-based application, and they wanted to have the users register with their email address, like you would on many web applications. Problem is that cache doesn't like @ as a username. So we used delegated authentication. We captured the name out of the web page where they registered, and we just alter that and allow it to go in. Somebody in this room knows what I'm talking about. What's that? You have to what? You have to enable domains in cache, and then you can log in. Oh, really? I didn't try that. Thank you. Hey, you know, even as a sales engineer, you learn something every day. Well, we didn't do that. I ran into the error, and we were in delegated authentication anyway to capture the username and password out of the web page, so we just altered it and moved on. But it's a good thing to know. So he stated there is a way you can enable domains in the security model, and then it would have taken the @ sign. I'm going to play with that later on, just out of curiosity. Thank you. So this authentication, let's go ahead and take a look at that. It's going to be a really straightforward example, if I've done everything correctly. And I'm not still having problems with the system here. I should have my reading glasses on. I apologize. So I know you can't tell, but I just went through and did an authentication, and that was purely done through LDAP. And I called my user application security, which I hard-coded to just say, yeah, I'm going to let you in. But we've created a whole infrastructure there. We've created the user within cache, and everybody's happy. We're logged in. But really, the power here is when you can cooperate with the LDAP environment. So use LDAP to define the user, and then enable the application to work with that and actually incorporate what it knows out of LDAP and make the application understand all that information. So we did allow the system, in this case, to create a custom schema, and this is what it looks like. We created properties for the application user ID. Remember, they're different. We created a property for app user type, the list of app user modules, and the list of app user menus. We then created an object class that creates all that. Now, a little note on OIDs here. You notice that I'm creating, or you may not notice, the identity or the unique value for this property is 999.1.1. That's not a real OID. OIDs always start with a 0, 1, or a 2. I created this intentionally because I didn't want to go out and register an OID. You don't have to register OIDs. Obviously, I did this, but if you go into production with a custom LDAP, you really should take the opportunity to go and register your OIDs. And in the documentation and the links at the end of this presentation, there is a link to where you go to get that, or one of the places you can go to get that. For the purposes of this, I'm never going public with it, so I just made up something that's way outside the possible range of domains. Now, when I included this in my LDAP schema, I now have the ability to define the user in one place. So all the authentication is going to happen, and the definition here is going to happen in LDAP. The authorization, the ongoing checking of, am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to go here? That's still in the application, though, and we have to work with that, and we have to interact with that. So again, we're going to come over here. I'm going to go to Atelier, and I'm going to enable my next example. Let me comment out a few lines here. And I have my code sample 1 here, but I am going to comment this out. And I'm going to uncomment this code, which we will go through. Yeah, there's something really weird going on with this system, I'm telling you. Okay, so that's enabled. Now, part of our security model for our application, though, normally the way the application worked was it prompted me for a username, it prompted me for a password, and it prompted me for which module I wanted to go to. So within Z-Authenticate, we have a routine, an entry point called Get Credentials. Get Credentials is where you can interrupt or intercept our way of prompting and provide your own way of prompting. So for example, where that web page wanted to register the user as an email address, we didn't want to be prompted. We wanted to take it out of their registration process. So we interrupted the flow of where I prompted, and I just read from the request. I read from the % request, extracted that information, because they've already given it to me, why should I prompt again, and I processed through. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to provide a prompting, because it's only in Telnet, so I can do this all with simple code. Now I'm going to add a prompt for the application module to the whole process. So if I come up here, okay, this is oh, this is really, I just ran through this morning, and for some reason, there we go. Keyboard always helps. So I just compiled it and made that code active. So if I go back now and look at how this thing is working, so instead of just creating the basic stuff that existed hard-coded, what I'm doing now is I'm taking the full name out of my attributes, just like I did before. I'm taking the comments, I'm taking the username, I'm taking the passwords. But now I'm coming down here and I'm getting the user type out of my attributes. That's coming out of that custom property we just added. That's user type is then being used to go and get the roles out of the database. So I'm talking to the application and saying, based upon this user type, which roles should I allow this user to get into? So none of it's hard-coded, and I'm using the application, what's defined in the application security model, to feed what came out of LDAP. So I'm working in cooperation with the two environments. I'm getting a list of modules, and I'm using that to get the namespace. So now if I go in and I do an authentication, what I should see happening I'll restart this session, and it's going to, you notice the user name password is slightly different, and I'm coming in as Jack again, and I'm going to type in this password, and I'm going to say which module is supposed to go into, AP. And that takes me into the right namespace. If I had done something a little bit different, and did Jack A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, but now I'm going to type in orders. I really need my reading glasses here. Come on. So now I'm in the samples namespace instead. So it read the application security, it read LDAP, got the properties out of LDAP, went over to the application, says, okay, if I'm going into orders, which namespace do I belong in? Brought that in, and also included all the roles I'm supposed to have for the application security itself. And that's all what was done in this section of code here. So I'm going to stop for a moment, and I want to see if there's any questions before I move on to some other things. So let me see if I understand your question right. So what you're saying, I have a master role defined in inner systems, and as part of that master role, I have other roles that are associated with it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, you could set up something like that, absolutely. How? Well, again, when you assign a role, you assign resources to a role, not other roles to a role. But you can do, if you wanted to set up a master role, as you're saying, and then had a table someplace that defined other roles that you actually wanted to assign to this user. So you never actually, let's see if I'm getting this right, you never actually assign the master role to a user. That never really gets assigned. You're assigning all the other roles that you get to through that. Okay, so yes, you could do that, and then you could do that through the authentication. In that case, you'd be using the class libraries for interacting with the cache security model and be querying into, okay, what makes up this role, and then pull all that information in, make that available here. Any other questions?
Do you have an example of this where you use like a secure port for LDAP, like LDAP?
I obviously didn't set it up. Yes, you can absolutely set up the secure sockets layer, SSL, TLS type of security.
And then do you have to put the certificate for the client account in, like the SS?
You need to have the certificate, and then you call, when you actually do the init call, right after that there's a call to enable TLS. Does that answer your question? So the question is, can you make your connection to the LDAP server secure? Absolutely. Wouldn't be much use as a security model if we couldn't do that. So absolutely, you can use SSL TLS, because again, it's a TCP protocol, and you just have to, when you init the connection to the server, you have to enable the TLS there. And then you're done. Any other?
Can you use this to set up multiple LDAP servers for like DR purposes? If one goes down,
Sure. I mean, this is code. You can do anything you want here. So if you had multiple LDAP servers, so the question is, can I have a failover situation? What if I can't talk to my main LDAP server and I have a failover one? So I could definitely write that into the code. I just have to have a way of knowing who's the primary and who are the backup servers. And if I can't contact this one, so I can't init to it, if I can init to it, I can talk to it. But if I can't init to it, well then fail over to the other ones. Just roll through a global or however you store that information and go to the other backup servers. I'm sorry? Yes, you could do that too, yes. You still have to turn it on when you init though. So if you go to the port, you still have to turn it on. Yes. So the question was, do you have to know that you're doing TLS and do something special? You can go to a port 636. I have to think about that for a second. Too many numbers flying around. So you can go to that port and then it knows that it has the capability to do TLS, but you're still going to have to enable it on the connection. Anything else? Oh, come on, it can't be that easy. So again, the basic thing to realize here with Z-Authenticate is that you can do pretty much anything you want here. It's code. You're all people who know how to do this stuff. You can do just about anything, grab information from just about anywhere. This example is talking about how to use LDAP, work with LDAP, to feed an application security model and make this all work together in a seamless way. That's the best way if you're dealing with security, because you want that atomic operation. You don't want them to get into the system and get past the gates to the fortress before you're really sure they're allowed to do whatever they're doing. So interact with LDAP, you do your security model. You're still at this point in the security authentication area of the InterSystems platform. So if anything fails here, anything at all, you get access denied, you're done. So only if you go through this entire process and do it successfully and return a successful status will the user be allowed in. And then you've already got all the details about what they're allowed to do. And the last piece of this puzzle was I told you we had to create an in-memory architecture or in-memory profile for this user for my application to work. So my application wants to query this in-memory structure. I simulate that here by just creating a process private global. I load that stuff up there, and now the application is happy. I don't have to change my code. I don't have to redefine all my users, but I can define everything in LDAP, authenticate against LDAP, use LDAP to feed my application and do my authorization for the application purposes within my code. There's a question back there? Oh, I thought I saw a hand going. Okay, well, let's just wrap this up a little bit. So I already went to the questions. So I set up Open LDAP, as I said. This is not Active Directory. Didn't want to have to pay for a license. So I set up CentOS using Open LDAP 2.4. Here are some links to help you, because I'll tell you, Google's a wonderful thing. There are so many answers out there, and they're mutually exclusive. So I had to hunt around quite a bit to find the one that was going to work under CentOS 7, because it turns out I've worked with LDAP many times. Realized as I set this up, I never set one up from scratch. I've worked with it. I never set it up. So a lot of these instructions you have are either out of date because LDAP changed, Open LDAP changed, so they no longer use a config file. They now put all the configuration settings in an LDAP directory. And none of the instructions were following that except for the one at the top there. So these are some good links for you to use. Some basic commands that are I found useful and helpful in dealing with this, including my favorite was deleting the schema, because there is no way to delete the schema in LDAP. You have to do it yourself. So I think I have a link up there for how to do that. Some more links and more information. Links to our documentation for LDAP, like I said, is very well documented, so there was no sense in me going through the details of LDAP, the basic stuff, because it's very well documented. The class documentation for the actual API that we used, how to do delegated authentication, the example code for Z-Authenticate Mac and LDAP Mac. Now, I will point something out at LDAP Mac. I wrote my own Open LDAP Mac because this one is out of date for working with Open LDAP. Didn't work for me. In the code that you can download from this presentation, I've included my version of it, so you can work with that. And if you need to or want to create custom schemas, you want to get your own OIDs, and there's the link for that. And last but not least, so where do we go from here? So there are sessions, lots of sessions on security this year. Authentication, when the usual won't do, distributed SQL security. The one I really love is the OAuth 2.0 integration. And just because we use Atelier, taking the tour of Atelier would be a good thing. That's our new IDE. We encourage you to use our mobile app on our Slack channel. If you need to contact me, if you have any further questions, please contact me through that, or Andreas Dykow, who is our product manager for this. After the summit, all of these presentations, we're doing things a little bit differently this year. Probably Wednesday afternoon, from what I'm told, all of the presentation materials will be up on the developers community. We encourage you to go there and grab whatever you want to look at, and all my code samples, including, mine's the largest one, I'm sorry, because I included the full virtual machine. So you'll have a full working LDAP environment that exactly matches what we did here today, if you download that. It's a VM player virtual machine. Learning services, great place to go. A lot of everything we've done this year, we are making a concerted effort. We were told how to structure things so that we can make it available as learning services. They're going to take everything we do and we're going to turn them into classes. So go to InterSystems Global Summit 2016 Learning Services, and you'll get more information there. So final line of defense for all of you, of course, is your sales engineer. So if you can't find me, you can't find Andreas, but you're thinking, I know they talked about something here. Talk to your sales engineer, we'll get it for you. And last but not least, survey says, please go to your mobile app and fill out the survey. As you noticed this year, there's a lot of changes that we've made to the summit. We've made those changes in response to what we hear from you all. Good, bad, ugly, whatever it is, we want to hear it so that we can make it better, or if you like something, we can continue in that direction. So please fill out your survey. There is only one way to do surveys this year. It's on the app. We didn't have any paper forms. If you have an issue or a concern and you want to fill out something or do something, go to see the registration booth. They might be able to help you set something up on a PC or somehow get into there. All right. And if there's no more questions, if you see me walking around, grab me, ask me a question. I'd be happy to help out. Hope you have a good summit.